Okay, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're joining us from another part of the world. I hope you're all doing well, and thank you for coming to today's webinar on counter mapping for and with communities. Today's presentation over the next half hour or so seeks to showcase several initiatives that we as a collective have been involved in over the past decade in the Philippines through what we loosely call counter mapping. But beyond just introducing examples of counter mapping engagements with communities, we wanted to bring together and open up a dialogue and conversation for people doing similar work across different contexts and backgrounds, and for those interested in undertaking similar projects and initiatives. The goal is tapping the potentials of counter mapping and developing mutual learning through venues and spaces such as this. We will have plenty of time later for questions and discussion after we listen to the short presentations from colleagues about their experiences and lessons from counter mapping activities in the Philippines. Again, you may post your questions or comments in the corresponding chat box or comment box along with your name and affiliation. Our presenters today are from Syracuse University and the University of the Philippines, and they include Andre Ortega, Oni Martinez, Yanni Lopez, Miguel Garcia, Bernardino de la Cruz, and me, Christian Sagi. This webinar is the first of several events in the Counter Mapping as Urban Resistance seminar series, which is supported by the Urban Studies Foundation Seminar Series Grant and organized by the Counter Mapping PH Network, the Department of Geography at the University of the Philippines, the Department of Geography and Environment at Syracuse University, and the Social Science and Philosophy Research Foundation. To talk a bit more about the seminar series and what activities to expect in the next 6 months, I turn it over to Professor Oni Martinez.
Thank you so much, Christian. So I will be talking about how we came about the proposal for this webinar series. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Hello? Yes, hello. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right. Thank you so much. Right. The Counter Mapping as Urban Resistance Seminar Series is a part of the initiatives of the collective that was organized by researchers, academics, artists, activists, students, and it is a nonprofit research network that seeks to forward campaigns that aim to educate and capacitate communities against forms of development aggression and dispossession in the country. We go by the name Counter Mapping PH Network. It is an interdisciplinary group of individuals from diverse backgrounds who are in one way or another involved in counter mapping, crowdsource mapping, GIS, map art, participatory mapping, and many other mapping practices that foster community involvement, and it's a team that advocates for social justice. The series of activities we are launching today were conceptualized, as mentioned also by Dr. Christian Sangin, with the following objectives. Next slide, please. That would be to explore various mapping or counter mapping contexts and practices from across the world that interface with urban development issues and contestations. We can move on to the next slide, please. Hello?
Ma'am,
Yes?
the share screen is a bit late, but it the share screen is a bit late, but
There's a
we need to
delay.
see
Sure,
the
sure. It's
discussion.
okay. It's okay. All right, let me just continue. The series of activities we're launching today, we conceptualize it with the primary goal of exposing or exploring various countermapping contexts and practices from across the world that interface with urban development issues. We aim to meet this goal through collaboratively documenting the plural knowledges and methods about cartographic modes of representation that are involved in urban resistance. Secondly, the seminar series were designed to serve as an avenue for scholars and those who are involved in similar pursuits to tap into the participatory nature of counter mapping and how it can be utilized to confront injustices against marginalized, that are being committed against marginalized communities within and beyond urban spaces. And as the space for solidarity and collective action, we seek to connect academic institutions, communities, people's organizations, activist groups, and various community-centered initiatives at multiple sites and scales towards our continued collaboration for social justice and sustainability. Next slide, please. So the seminar series is made possible, as mentioned by Dr. Christian Sagin, through the Urban Studies Foundation Seminar Series Award. So the USF is an organization that was established in 2008 with the objective of advancing academic research and education in the field of urban studies. It also aims to promote knowledge transfer, mobilization, and exchange in this particular area of research. So in support of scholarly debate and dialogues that contribute to high-quality urban research studies, USF sponsors the Seminar Series Awards, and academics and non-academic actors all over the world can apply for this program. So to learn more about the awards, you can visit the website of the Urban Studies Foundation. And through the generous grant and our long-running partnership with the University of the Philippines Department of Geography, the Department of Geography and Environment at Syracuse University, we can proceed with the next slide. And also our partner in the University of the Philippines, Social Sciences and Philosophy Research Foundation, we organized 4 activities for this year that aim to foster conversations and insights on how urban communities are undergoing different kinds of transformations, many of which are exacerbating precarity and resulting in displacement and dispossession. And how these are being experienced locally by urban residents from the ground or underground. These discussions and workshops would not materialize without the help of our participating organizations and individuals who we invited to join us in these activities as our resource speakers and as participants. So with regards to the schedule of our activities, next slide, please. Today, we are holding the public webinar. This one is focused on various counter-mapping initiatives in the Philippines to further our understanding of counter-mapping as a promising and creative approach towards challenging and resisting market-oriented modes of development in cities as well as in rural communities. Also this week, on the 26th and the 28th, roundtable discussions and workshops will be held together with organizations that undertake advocacy work and consolidates collective action on various sectoral issues regarding human rights and basic needs such as transportation, housing, food, and other necessities in the urban context. These discussions are going to be held virtually. They aim to document and put together the experiences and practices of various communities in confronting rights issues and the risks that they face as marginalized peoples. So the activities that will be involved here are spatial storytelling, collaborative mapping, that is to learn more about the sectoral strategies that are set in place or are being planned towards addressing pressing socioeconomic issues. And this will be articulated and mapped so that we can better understand the interrelationships of our advocacies and develop our campaigns and strategies further. Next slide, please. Now, this same year, on March 15 and 16, we are going to host an international conference, and many of those who signed up for this event, in fact, are interested to join. and some of them are going to speak in this international conference. The aim of this conference is to bring together scholars, activists, practitioners, and community leaders and members from around the world working on various forms of, and methods of counter mapping in the urban context, with the aim of building a global counter mapping network, such as the one that we are continuing to build here in the Philippines. So the features of these international conference would be the panel discussions, paper and creative output presentations, plenary sessions on diverse themes that tackle spatial representation and cartographic visions of the urban space from different parts of the globe that are being organized. We are organizing this based on the abstract submissions that we were able to collect in the last quarter of 2021. So many of you would remember that we had a call last year with regard to this conference. And so we are very grateful for the positive reception of our call. And we are working hard to ensure that we provide an accessible and effective venue for sharing the multitude of counter mapping initiatives that we were able to gather through the abstract submissions. The registration does not require any fees, and that's good news for everyone. And we will all be able to share more information about this through our online website and social media pages very soon. So please watch out for further announcements and updates from our social media websites. And then lastly, mapping workshops that feature geospatial technologies, artistic curation, and participatory mapping approaches such as sketch mapping, crowdsourced mapping. These are all scheduled in a mapping workshop that will be conducted in the month of June, also this year. We will be using a broad array of mapping media in these particular workshops, and these will be facilitated by our invited speakers. These platforms would include online mapping tools, desktop GIS, paper and pencil, as well as aerial imagery. And so as a platform for mutual learning and solidarity, we hope that this seminar series engages everyone in partaking in a continuing journey towards a sustainable and just transformations in our communities. And so with that, I would like to end this section of our webinar and proceed with the video presentation of Dr. Andre Ortega. Marami pong salamat.
Magandang araw sa inyo lahat and mabuhay. This is Andre Ortega, and I am here to introduce all of you to what countermapping is, and I will also share some of our conceptual and practical insights drawn from our experiences in conducting countermapping projects. Let me start with an often cited quotation from John Harley stating that maps are never value-free images. By this, we mean that maps are political. They serve particular interests and intentions. What is projected and reflected visually in maps represent not just the interest of the cartographer or whoever made the map, but they also carry with them a host of institutions that commissioned these maps. The choice of colors, legend, and what is visually projected paints a particular picture to the public. At the same time, maps have intended impacts that shape policies, public discourse, and geopolitical agenda. In short, we need to acknowledge the politics of mapping if we are going to think of the diverse way of conducting counter-mapping projects. At its core, counter-mapping is rooted to the notion of counter, meaning countering dominant modes of mapping, which is oftentimes associated with the state and other power structures. We contend that counter-mapping is inherently an act of resistance against dominant tendencies in mapping, in the multiple ways dominant institutions have used mapping as a mode of reproducing hegemonic practices and structures. But at the same time, counter-mapping is also interlinked with efforts that aim towards emancipation and liberation, particularly in addressing the concerns of marginalized peoples and communities. As an act of resistance, countermapping aims to foreground the voices and experiences of marginalized peoples, which are oftentimes not heard or are explicitly silenced for a particular agenda and interests. As such, at least in the case of our countermapping projects, we have partnered with communities to bring forth their geographical narratives or stories about their places, communities, and lands. In our mapping projects, we identified key components that are integral. First is the identification of the problem or issue, which entailed collaboration and participation with communities. We ask what is the main issue and in what ways can mapping address this. Another component is data collection. In here, we identify what data to collect and how to collect it. Another component is the production of maps. In here, we engage in the ways in which we analyze the data that we collect and produce maps. We ask what kind of map outputs are needed to address the problem. Should it be in print format or should it be digital maps that can be transformed into memes or infographics that can be posted online? The last component we want to emphasize is communication. In here, we seriously reflect on how the maps will be communicated to particular audiences or for what particular purpose. Are we going to hang a big tarpaulin map for the community? Or are we going to create professionally made maps that will be part of a formal report to be shared to public institutions? Now I'd like to turn to some impacts of countermapping based on our experience from our different projects. The first is exposition. By exposition, we mean countermapping enables the exposition of critical issues that are oftentimes hidden from the purview of the public. In some of our projects, we expose the plight of farmers and indigenous peoples who struggle for land. For example, in the case of a suburban development south of Manila, we counter the maps promulgated by real estate companies, such as this map, which is oftentimes shared to the public. To counter this, we work with farmers who are fighting their right to remain in their lands. A picture here shows geography students laying out aerial maps of a landed estate to identify contested sites. This next slide shows the contested geographies that underlay the suburban lands that are being marketed by real estate developers. What these spaces demonstrate are the spaces of resistance, where farmers are fighting for their land while private security and military are deployed to facilitate dispossession of these farmers. Another point we want to raise is the ability of countermapping to ground contradictions. By this, we mean that countermapping is able to locate and situate the struggles that many marginalized groups are fighting for, wherein maps can help visualize the grounded and material impacts of particular development projects. This particularly helps to communicate to the multiple publics from which the maps are intended for, and most importantly to communities who are able to visualize the material impacts of development aggression. For example, one countermapping project we were involved in was contending against a development project north of Luzon called the Aurora Pacific Ecozone, or APECO. The master plan of the project involves a series of maps that lay out development in that part of Luzon. In this slide, we can see, for example, a map that shows the different clusters that comprise the project. However, underlying these clusters shown in the previous slide are dynamic places which are rich in history. On the ground, we can find sacred spaces, settlements, fishing grounds, and other places of importance. For residents who are against the development project, getting involved in counter mapping enabled them to visualize and make sense of how and where various elements of the project would impact them and their communities. In the counter mapping activities that we did, they were able to see the absurdity of particular projects. For example, in this map, we can find that in this cluster, certain development projects will be built in certain locations of the peninsula. However, these projects, such as the Navy Post or the water cottages, will be built in several areas where residents are living or where burial sites are located. Through the counter mapping activity, residents were able to ground and see the contradictions of these projects. And this brings us to another lesson on counter mapping. Counter mapping enables communities who struggle to consolidate multiple narratives and concerns. By working on a map, the tensions surrounding particular projects are consolidated on a map sheet. For example, in the case of the map we showed earlier, we can see how counter mapping enabled the consolidation of individual and community narratives to create a single map that can be used to counter the development project. In the map, we can see the multiple sites that are important to the community. Another point that we want to emphasize is the importance of engaging the public. In the various counter mapping projects we have conducted, we have tried to think of various ways of engaging multiple publics. In thinking seriously about this, we consider the various modes, platforms, and formats of the maps that we were creating. In this slide, we can see an example of one of the counter mapping projects that combined theater with maps in order to foreground the struggles of an urban poor community in Metro Manila. In thinking about engaging maps with multiple publics, we can say that there are multiple forms and modalities of counter mapping, from exhibitions to map art to infographics or to poster maps. The last point that I would like to make is the importance of ethics. In this slide, we have listed several practical and ethical considerations that we would like to share and that perhaps we can discuss later on during the latter part of this webinar. The point being is that we need to seriously rethink how we conduct research when we do counter mapping. Counter mapping enables us to rethink collaboration and participation, where geographic information is co-produced. In counter mapping, we emphasize the importance of being clear about our politics. In partnering with communities, we'd like to emphasize the strong sense of commitment to the needs of our partners and the importance of having mutual respect and being clear about our roles and expectations. So with this slide, I am ending my presentation and I would like to turn you over to our next presenter. Thank you very much.
All right, so now I will present the Counter Mapping Hacienda Luisita student initiated project. Can you see it now? Please let me know.
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you so much. All right, so the counter mapping project of the Junior Philippine Geographical Society is what I'm going to talk about. But first, let me mention about Hacienda Luisita, describe it more in detail. Hacienda Luisita is a sugarcane plantation, one of the largest in Luzon at least, comprising 11 barangays in the municipalities of Concepcion and La Paz, and also includes portion of Tarlac City in the province of Tarlac in Central Luzon. The contested area of almost 6,500 hectares is under the control of two powerful and influential clans in the country, the Aquinos and the Cojuangcos, and the business associates and partners. The land has been subjected to various land arrangements that disproportionately benefited the business entities involved while compromising the rights and welfare of its farm workers. In fact, in 2004, if you would remember, there were reported 7 individuals, but if you will look into the reports of other organizations, it counts to up to 14 who were killed. Among those protesting, the retrenchment of hundreds or even thousands of hacienda workers, which we remember in the grim history of peasant struggle as the Hacienda Luisita massacre. Shareholder schemes were put into place to evade the real issue of land ownership for farmers actually tilling the land, and until 2011, the Philippine Supreme Court ordered the sharing of proceeds of sales of portions of the hacienda. And eventually in 2012, the court also ruled that 4,195 hectares of the contested area be distributed to farmers. To date, however, land distribution in hacienda is marred with issues such as distributed lots being located far from the residence of the awarded farmers and other dubious schemes of implementation. The current forms of coercion against farmers and their families, and also the people in support of their cause, harassment and illegal detention, are still being experienced. It is also reported that out of the original extent of the hacienda, only 40% remains to be devoted to sugarcane plantation. This is from the Philippine Competition Commission report that was published in 2020. It's a very recent document. Now, counter mapping Hacienda Luisita was part of the student-led project that is called Contour Mapping for the People, that was initiated by the Junior Philippine Geographical Society that is based in UP. It's been an ongoing activity of the organization since 2010. This project aims to highlight the plight of marginalized communities impacted by development in various contexts, such as alienation from their livelihood sources, dispossession and displacement caused by land conversion projects, to give way to capitalist and corporate interests. In 2017, JPGS organized a series of activities with partner organizations. In the university and also outside of the university. For example, they held an exhibit and also disseminated informative materials about Hacienda Luisita through their social media pages online. An example of which is the map that we are showing here, which illustrates the different kinds of activities aside from farming within the Hacienda Luisita lands. This particular map was also created by a student at that time of who is a member of JPGS, Mr. Harold Pedregosa. So JPGS in 2017 organized several activities and educational campaigns to foreground the experiences and struggles of the farmers in Hacienda Luisita. Some of these are the seminars that they conducted in partnership with the University Student Council and partner organizations. We call this the Alternative Classroom Learning Experience. They also had an exhibit by the end of 2017, a culmination activity of all the series of activities that we did with respect to campaigning and sharing the issues about Hacienda Luisita, such as online information dissemination, including the poster maps and infographics that were shown earlier, and also an online campaign for indicated here, Hacienda Buwagin, which means the elimination of the hacienda system. And it's not just for the case of Luisita, but other haciendas in the country. So as a student organization, the JPGS has through the years been involved in these kinds of initiatives and activities using maps and several forms of information dissemination to involve the public in the discussion and dialogue on land struggles in the Philippines. I now turn you over to Dr. Yani Lopez for another counter mapping project in the Philippines, which is in New Clark City.
Okay, thank you, Oni. Good afternoon, everyone. So the second project is entitled Counter Mapping for Peri-Urban Social Justice. Next slide, please. Okay, so this was organized by a team of geographers, students, volunteers, residents, and community organizers. This project mapped the experiences of marginalized communities caught in urban transition. It piloted a participatory counter mapping methodology which produced maps that communities can use for their struggles and for sustainable community planning. So the study focuses on communities affected by the construction of the New Clark City, located north of Manila. So New Clark City is a smart city project promoted as the Philippines' first sustainable and resilient city. So it is being built on a former military estate covering 9,450 hectares of land located 100 kilometers north of Manila. Next slide, please. So to account for the spatial transformation in the said areas, the study aims to, next slide, please. So let me just enumerate the objectives. Map the everyday experiences of the community, including the experiences of dispossession. Second, examine spaces of contestations and resistance. And third, co-produce maps relevant to the community struggles. Next slide, please. So the project focused on 3 sectoral groups and accounted for their everyday lived experiences. So we have the lowland and upland farmers, we have the youth and the Aitas, the indigenous group living within the areas. Next slide, please. So the team conducted a series of fieldwork activities involving mental and community mapping, focus group discussions, walking interviews, autophotography, and validation activities. Participants developed their own mental maps of their community by identifying sites of everyday importance, their everyday mobilities, and places of dispossession and resistance. Mental maps were processed during focus group discussions and informed the community maps generated. The walking interviews ground truth the mental and community maps that were developed and analyzed during the focus group discussions. In showing these areas, the participant narrated important accounts surrounding the sites. Meanwhile, autophotography was conducted during the walking interviews as participants were asked to take photos of actual sites significant to their lives. Validation activities were also conducted to confirm the initial findings of the study. Next slide, please. So New Clark City, or NCC, is a flagship project of the Basis Conversion and Development Authority, or BCDA, a Philippine government-owned and controlled corporation. So across government media platforms, New Clark City, NCC, is lauded as an urban dream that is both disaster resilient and environmentally sound. However, grounded narratives generated by those both grassroots organizations and members of the community found these claims contentious. So New Clark, yes, New Clark City will be comprised of several districts. Previous slide po. So New Clark City will be comprised of several districts, from technology parks and central business districts to mixed income housing and university campuses. So the various districts and land uses will be transacted with property developers through joint venture agreements with the government. Next slide, please. So the project is posed to impact thousands of farmers and indigenous peoples living in the area, shown as red dots on the map. So in the last few years, ground operations have been underway as farmlands, regardless of whether farmers were compensated or not, have been bulldozed while several villages have been enclosed. In the highland fringes, indigenous Aita communities face the danger of displacement. To quell the resistance, militarization of the area has intensified as residents face harassment and intimidation from security forces. Next slide, please. So the next 3 slides present a collective map output whereby participants identified and marked significant changes on large-scale aerial images of the community printed on large format prints on tarpaulins. So this map shows the landscape changes in the community where trees have been marked for cutting, hills and mountains have been excavated and eventually flattened. So next slide, please. So this map identifies houses, a community chapel, farm areas demolished, and also the establishment of a golf course. Next slide, please. Okay, so due to previous slide po, due to road construction along Mount Dalin, this map shows footpaths utilized by the upland farmers, and the Aitas became steeper and inaccessible. So the community is also at risk of landslides due to loose soil after excavation. Okay, next slide po. So based on the study's findings, the New Clark City project will not just negatively impact communities located within the 9,000 plus hectares estate where it will be built, but also those situated along the fringe of the planned development. We noted 3 significant impacts: displacement of communities, livelihood changes, impact on community relations. So displacement, one of the striking findings is the massive displacement that the New Clark City has caused and will continue to cause. The research team has visited farmlands and houses that were bulldozed to give way to the roads leading to the different structures of NCC. Second, livelihood changes. NCC has proved to have negative effects on the livelihood of the communities. So despite claims by the BCDA that the project will generate jobs, the affected communities are still living in precarity. The construction has also affected the livelihood of farmers and indigenous peoples who depend on their crops and fruit-bearing trees for sustenance, since the project required trees and houses to be cut down and demolished. Third, relationship in the community. So prior to the NCC construction, people knew one another and helped each other during trying times. However, with the influx of migrant workers, there were already many unfamiliar faces. Catcalling and fights broke out every so often that community members fear for their safety and security. So a key lesson from the project is the critical importance of solidarity among academics, NGOs, and communities, particularly those affected by big developments such as the New Clark City. So through participatory countermapping, grounded narratives of displacement and dispossession are foregrounded. This study develops progressive mapping that not only contests state-rendered maps, but also aids in the struggle of marginalized communities against development aggression. And for the last example of a counter-mapping initiative, I turn you over to Bernardino and Miguel for the presentation on human rights defenders in Negros Island.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I am Bernardino de la Cruz Jr. and
I am Leonardo Miguel Garcia.
And we are here to present our counter mapping project regarding Negros Island. So the official name of our project is Geonarratives of Human Rights Defenders in Negros Island, Philippines. And the research project was administered by the University of the Philippines, Department of Geography from September 2020 until July 2021 through the funding of the Commission on Human Rights. So for this particular purpose, human rights defenders will be referred to as HRD or HRDs. To provide a brief background about the project, in recent years, the Philippines has become one of the deadliest countries for HRDs. HRDs frequently face arbitrary arrests, extrajudicial killings, and various forms of harassments and threats. At the epicenter of this are the struggles of HRDs in Negros Island. The island is formally comprised of two provinces, Negros Occidental and Negros Oriental, as seen in the map. The island got its name during the era of Spanish colonization here in the Philippines, as they believed that the island was inhabited by dark-skinned people. In the island, more than 90 HRDs, lawyers, farmers, teachers, and church workers have been killed since 2017. In response to these issues, this project examines the context-specific violence faced by HRDs in Negros Island, analyzing the spatial narratives of HRD harassment, threats, and deaths. So, the project objectives. So number one, highlight the individual narratives and geographies to counter the largely impersonal way HRDs are portrayed in the media. HRDs are usually portrayed as people who are getting paid just to join rallies and protest actions. In worst cases, they are being tagged or locally called red tag as members of the Communist Party of the Philippines and its armed wing, the New People's Army. In the Philippines, to be red tagged or to be accused as a member of the communist groups is very dangerous because many HRDs who died in Negros Island had also experienced to be red tagged prior to their murder. So one of the objectives of this project is to highlight HRDs' narratives and to humanize them as well. Second objectives is to map micro-level geographies of HRDs and the emergent necropolitics in Negros Island. In simple terms, I can describe necropolitics as a notion that recognizes the role of dominant powers in propagating indirect and direct deaths among populations. Third, examine how HRDs construct ideas of risk and security in light of attacks on HRDs. Number four, understand the coping strategies of HRDs to respond to the constant risk to their safety and well-being. So, the project methodology. This study utilized data collected from secondary and primary sources. The five main data collection methods are, number one, document review, number two, webinar. Through a public webinar, which discussed the situation of HRDs in the island, the information shared by research speakers were also utilized for this project. Number three, mental mapping. Through mental mapping, personal experiences of HRDs have been spatially articulated. Sample mental maps will be shown later. Number four, mobile survey via KoboCollect. So KoboCollect is a free and open source mobile app typically used for on-ground surveying and data gathering. And specifically, it lets its users collect coordinates or spatial information which help HRDs identify their unsafe spaces. Number five, online focus group discussions. This project utilized qualitative case study research that emphasizes the context-specific dynamics of violence. Using this methodology, the project accounts for the lived and authentic experiences of HRDs in selected areas in Negros Island. This project also contributes to the spatially oriented methodologies that can be used in investigating human rights and similar issues. Most activists do not talk about their own hopes, fears, and concerns, and this research attempts to propose the use of mental mapping along with other methods to help and facilitate the sharing of HRD's experiences and thoughts. Several participants have shared that creating mental maps of their perceived safe and unsafe spaces have provided them with the chance to process their experiences in those places. Here is a sample of mental mapping output from one of the project's participants. So as seen in the photo, it is an HRD illustrated his experience in a mental map wherein a group of unidentified armed men barged into their office to physically harass him with firearms, which preceded his arbitrary arrest. As seen on the mental map, at least 6 unidentified armed men are pointing their guns to the HRD lying prone. Shortly after, state forces arrived and served a warrant for the office to be searched by the police. Upon searching throughout the office, they found firearms and explosives, which were planted by the armed men who barged earlier, while the HRD was being forced towards the ground. Consequently, as reflected in the neon-colored drawing in the mental map, he was arrested and charged with violation of national laws concerning illegal possession of firearms and explosives. The place and context of the HRDs, as visualized in their individual mental maps, provided a rich but disturbing glimpse into the everyday challenges that they face. So the next part is for Miguel.
This juncture, we will highlight specific aspects where we think this project counter maps particular issues in Negros concerning human rights defenders. Primarily, this project foregrounds HRD's narratives and produce various maps that contest mainstream portrayal of HRDs, contest everyday geographies of violence, and opposes landscape of risk and safety in Negros Island. First, this project counters the mainstream narrative, negative portrayal of HRDs. By letting HRDs define activists or human rights defenders, their tasks and motivations, this project humanizes human rights defenders amidst rampant smear campaigns and vilification. HRDs, according to the participants, are people who work to protect and promote not the interests of the rich, but the collective rights of the masses who have long been suffering from systemic violence. Another participant elaborated that being an HRD is not a paid job nor a cult, but a reflection of an entire belief system and day-to-day affirmation of their stances on fighting for human rights. HRDs that originated from the marginalized sectors, such as the peasant class, share their first-hand experience of social inequalities that furthered their interest to fight. Insinuating activists were just brainwashed is an insult to peasant HRDs who were exposed to the poor state of agriculture in Negros. Their narratives show that HRDs do not seek violence nor power, instead justice for the victims and the powerless. Next slide, please. This project also receives the manifestations of everyday authoritarianism in Negros. Through the mental maps, HRDs demonstrated the geographies of violence in Negros that they inhabit and contend with on a day-to-day basis. They experience various but interconnected forms of violence and harassment. They face psychological warfare from state operatives, primarily the military and the police, in the form of intimidation, constant surveillance, and threats, as shown in figures 1 and 2. Complementing these are the death threats that HRDs regularly face, alongside gender-based threats, primarily directed to female HRDs. Concomitant to red tagging is the stigmatization of HRDs and their organizations. Worst, HRDs experience harassment. They confront assault in mobilizations and experience violent and arbitrary arrest, as shown in figure 3 and what Moy discussed a while ago. But perhaps the most notable in recent years are the extrajudicial killings that have taken the lives of HRDs since 2016. EJKs do not choose a time or place to execute. It could happen at the comforts of their home, while walking in the streets, the city, or in the fields. Harabas and Flora, both longtime HRDs, expressed their fear of roads, especially at night, because it exposes them to vehicles or more probably riding in tandems, a two-man type of operation that carried out summary executions in the island. In Figure 4, Harabas illustrated unsafe spaces in his mental map, marking several red X's in his neighborhood, and colored roads yellow to indicate spaces where he observes extreme caution. While Flora colored all roads in her mental map violet to indicate that she is prone to EJK wherever in her community. Next slide, please. Or so, to visualize the shrinking safe spaces for HRDs, here is a dot density map showing the overall killings in Negros Island since President Rodrigo Duterte took office in 2016. There are a total of 431 casualties, with 60 human rights defenders who have been killed since 2016. Bloodbath and massacre is not an understatement in describing the killings in Negros Island. Next slide, please. Lastly, this project counters the silent narratives of risk and safety in Negros. According to the human rights defenders, the numerous forms of violence have effectively reduced the safe areas in which they can thrive. Many of their violent encounters took place in both urban and rural settings, as well as public and private spaces such as home, street, and even social media. HRD's everyday geographies have been confined by such violent situations, rendering practically all of their locations unsafe and potentially dangerous. In line with this, we produced an art map that aims to destabilize normal sceneries by overlaying HRD narratives. Seemingly safe spaces for most of us, like malls, markets, and roads, turned out to be a space of impunity and death for HRDs. This map is entitled Necros Island, a wordplay on Negros and Necros, or death. Contrary to the childish depiction of safe space, violent scenarios have been applied on the map. To conclude, next slide please. This project called for the democratic rights of the people to comprehensively bolster their goal to achieve social justice. Second, legal health and security support for HRDs. Third, awareness and ties of solidarity among various sectors, national and international groups. And fourth, several policy and institutional recommendations that will ensure safety of human rights defenders. For our next presenter, we would like to call on Sir Christian Carlos Agin to discuss lessons and reflections on the experiences of countermapping in the Philippines. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this final section. I would like to wrap up the presentations by providing a few reflections on countermapping with communities based on the experiences from the diverse examples we just briefly illustrated. So next slide, please. As a form of activist research approach, we think that framing the research project and creating spatial representations through collaborating with communities that are marginalized and oppressed remain a key feature of countermapping, and it's something that perhaps sets it apart from other forms of mapping. Mapping may also be framed as an activity embedded in social movement and as part of research that is rooted in critical thought and informed by grassroots experience. Next slide. Despite its name, countermapping is more than just making maps or using maps. More importantly, we believe it facilitates conversations beyond the events and objects that can be put on a map. It is a way of telling stories in space through the act of mapping. Countermapping draws its strength from a commitment towards change and transformation, and it's beyond, although it's a key part of it, beyond just communicating information. It entails ultimately critical and transformative mapping. Okay, next slide. As such, a few guiding principles we think may inform countermapping practices in their diversity. Here we identified countermapping as inclusive, transparent, sensitive to local cultures, ethical, empowering, transformative. These are idealized principles, but perhaps might guide practices when implemented on the ground. Next slide. But of course, there are several questions for reflection that we may still continue to pose. Counter mapping is an ongoing process, and we would say one that is not complete, finished, nor definitive. Some few questions to ponder include how co-production of knowledge is actually realized, given the forms of relations in knowledge production and expertise. Also asking what kinds of transformations are actually taking place in the lives of those involved in the research. How do they benefit from these projects, if they do, and how do these play out in their material everyday experiences? And also questions like what new relationships eventually are forged and what old ties are strengthened in the process of building solidarity. So these are iterative questions that need to be considered along the way. Okay, next slide. Furthermore, there is the question of sustainability and maintaining motivations to continue on with struggle and campaigns amid various pressures from all fronts. There is a need to assess also the capacities of individuals and organizations across different aspects of project implementation in terms of capacity for project management, the rigor of the methodology use, familiarity with particular techniques, and combining and synergizing a diversity of approaches that are often used for these kinds of projects. How we deal with tensions between diverse practices and approaches, given that communities are composed of various interests and spatialities, also remains an important question. Okay, next slide. Finally, we recognize a host of challenges and trajectories that counter mapping practices might take, knowing that the need to constantly facilitate dialogue, make methods sensitive to local contexts, to negotiate power relations, develop outputs that communities actually need or are relevant to them, and perhaps extend the possibilities of mapping with communities beyond what we have so far attempted. So we illustrated a few examples of techniques and methods of counter mapping, but of course there are plenty of others that might be attempted or tried for different contexts. But we think this openness to other possibilities and all these questions that we just recently posed, rather than giving definitive answers, might be a good way to end our presentation and hopefully open the floor for conversation. So thank you, everyone. So with that, we would like to open the floor for questions and comments. Again, you may write your questions or comments along with your name and affiliation in the chat box or comment box. And we will read them out in a little bit. Okay. Okay, so we have a few questions here. So if anyone from the panel would like to answer, just let me know. So one question is, what challenges have you faced in conducting counter mapping activities in the past? And another question asks, what motivated your network to conduct counter mapping initiatives?
Maybe I can answer that question.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. I think that there are a lot of counter mapping activities that have been done, especially working with students, but then they're not really, or they were not really conceptualized or referred to directly or as counter mapping, but in essence and in its very nature, they are. I'm speaking with respect to my own classes because sometimes we go into different areas or communities that are highly contested. And then one issue that I in myself, or siguro in terms of my practice, one dilemma is always, who do you collaborate when you go to the community? Because it's always a perception that you will have to go through, say, the formal channels formal institutions like the municipal government, LGUs. Of course, that's part of good practice. But then sometimes, your partners would also inform you that you might not get the answer that that you're looking for or you're searching for, because of the influence of those who are in power, who might be at the same time, deter or prevent you from really getting the answers that you need to know, or the actual situation in the area. So it's always a challenge for researchers to look into, and perhaps think really about who we should be partnering when we say local communities or local organizations or local institutions. While we recognize that state authorities are, well, officially they're the ones who should be in charge of these things, we also should recognize the fact that they may not be always the appropriate, I guess, channels to go through. And we should really be listening more carefully with the people who are on the ground, and partner with the local organizations and people organizations who are there doing the advocacies.
Okay, thank you, Oni. Siguro regarding the second question, perhaps Oni and Yannick and Miguel I could add regarding the motivation of starting up a network. So perhaps siguro one of the seeds for kind of attempting counter mapping was a research project that Andre and I initially did in Aurora, and that drew from work from political ecologists and critical cartographers, and kind of applying those methods in the case of a development project and how it will impact various groups of people on the ground, and kind of understanding the spatialities that are distinct and perhaps counter to official state spatialities, kind of help us find use for counter mapping as a particular technique, which in this case was applied in a particular context. So we know that counter mapping is a very, broad set of tools and approaches to various issues. But from there, I think there are other projects that eventually kind of, like what Oni mentioned, existing projects that have been sort of employing counter mapping methods, but have not been called that. And that eventually developed into a bigger network, including various academics, students, artists, community organizers from various different contexts. So I think that Siguro could explain in a bit some of the motivation. So I don't know if Yanni and Oni would want to add to this.
Hi, Christian. Siguro sasagot na ako in Filipino para doon sa tanong na ano yung naging motibasyon namin na para gamitin yung counter mapping na mga activities. Una sa lahat ay merong panawagan ang community, ang organizer ng community din na nais nila mapakinggan sila sapagkat may mga information or may mga kumakalat or hindi nga alam ng community yung mga nangyayari sa paligid nila. Wala silang alam sa ongoing na project, ano yung extent ng project. So parang doon ay wala silang idea. So naghahanap sila, nagtatanong sila kung merong makukuha mga datos regarding that. At pangalawa rin ay yung pangailangan din na ma-document yung kanilang mga narratives sapagkat meron silang nakukuha mga datos pero hindi nagre-reflect sa kanilang mga experiences. So sinasabi ng ilang mga authorities sa LGU, particularly dun sa area of study na walang maapektuhan na community. Doon, yun yung kanilang press release. Pero sa katotohanan, kapag pumunta ka sa area, nakita mo yung mga everyday na activities nila, doon sila nabubuhay, doon nila kinukuha yung kanilang pang araw-araw na source of sustenance, iba yung storya na nanggagaling sa community. At yun yung sigurong gusto rin namin ma-highlight para nga ma-counter yung sinasabi ng mga authorities or ng local yung state doon kung ano yung mga grand plans nila about the area. So yun yung isa sa mga motivation namin para ma-highlight din, ma-showcase din yung mga experiences ng mga community doon sa area na yun. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Annie. Okay, so we have a question in the chat box from Ellie of Masipag Inc. So is there also counter mapping in virtual spaces with regards to knowledge production and acquisition via internet entities such as Facebook, YouTube, alternative media, and so on? If yes, how does it translate to the actual counter mapping and vice versa? Further, how does it affect your approach to the community that utilizes such virtual spaces? So this is a question about extending counter mapping as a method or as an idea or approach in the virtual space. Perhaps you could think of examples.
Yeah, I think I can. This is also based on a recent presentation that involved me and MapBex and mental health awareness advocates who are all online crowdsourcing collectives. But we essentially framed that presentation in relation to counter cartographies and counter mapping. And this is also in relation to the presentation that we made, Dr. Joseph Palis and I, for the ICGS last year. So, for example, MapBex, which is an organization that advocates for LGBTQI safe spaces. Geo Ladies, which is an organization initiated by women who are doing mapping, drones, online crowdsourcing, online tools, essentially making use of virtual spaces to encourage members of the community or advocates for the rights of the underrepresented, to help map safe spaces. Because as, for example, MapBex mentioned in several of the presentations that they've had in the past, they are involved in a big initiative worldwide or globally, which is the OpenStreetMap. But then unfortunately, they noticed that their own safe spaces as LGBTQI are not reflected in these maps. And millions of users around the world are using, contributing data to OSM. But then there's not really that much venue or opportunity to map out the spaces that promote the rights and the welfare of the LGBTQ community. So they created MapBex in that light. And another example would be GeoLadies, who facilitate workshops, webinars that promote the mapping of spaces for children and mothers, for example, yung mga breastfeeding stations, conducting lectures and workshops on the use of satellite imagery, aerial photography or photogrammetry, but in relation to women activities, to further foreground spaces for women and children also at the same time. So these, I think, are some of the examples of utilizing virtual space, especially during, this was even pre-pandemic, this has been going on even before that. But I guess solidarity within the virtual space was further strengthened because of also the limits to public spaces where people could come together, so that the virtual space is where we now come together, for example, in this particular webinar and the succeeding mapping workshops and activities that the counter mapping PH network with partners under the USF grant would be conducting. So these are some of the examples na I can share with respect to how counter mapping can also flourish in the virtual space.
Okay, thank you, Oni. Thank you, Ellie, for your question. So speaking of perhaps method or technique question, so we know that GIS is very useful in mapping and it's very relevant in many counter mapping activities. So can we say that counter mapping can be done without GIS or this particular technology? So perhaps you can think about what are kind of the different methods that is possible in conducting counter mapping initiatives.
Hello, I think I can answer this question, sir.
Okay, go ahead, Bernadine.
My answer for this question is a bit related to the answer of Ma'am Oni for the last question about virtual spaces, because in my experience as a researcher in the geonarratives of human rights defenders in Negros Island, it was a common experience for human rights defenders to experience threats, red tagging, and other violence in social media via Facebook, Twitter, etc. So, of course, since these experiences happened in a virtual space, we cannot say that it happened on actual space because, as what I have said, it happened on social media. And I think this emphasizes the relevance of mental mapping because this process of mental mapping is very capable of letting the participants or the human rights defenders articulate their experiences using a pen and paper, though they cannot show actual spaces like physical spaces on their mental maps. They can still express their experiences using a mental map because at the end of the day, virtual space is still a space where you can experience a lot of things. And on top of that, I think mental mapping is really important in showing their aspirations, their goals, their dreams, because in mental mapping, we are very free to express whatever we want. So I guess the answer to that question is counter mapping methodologies depend on what are your goals, what are the information that you can say, etc. So I think that's my answer. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bernardino, for answering. So there are a variety of methods, perhaps. So we are in a way operating in a limited set of techniques that we're familiar with, but in many other examples from other parts of the world, we have different other cases of other techniques being used, and so perhaps the counter mapping as an activity should not just be limited to expertise in mapping, and I think that's where we can see kind of potentials of exploring, expanding counter mapping as a form of engagement with communities to kind of decenter expertise. Also, we may use techniques that are available to us, but then also consider that there are other ways of representing or experiencing space that might require other forms of methods and techniques. Okay, thank you. So we have a couple more questions from Max Quijano. Disaster mapping has been used against urban poor communities for purposes of clearing for future developments. How can counter mapping help communities if they are being presented satellite images or LiDAR maps which tell them that they should not be where they are settled because of risk exposure? Or yeah, we can also go to post another question while So another question is from Kenneth Cardenas. Una sa lahat, ang galing, congratulations. Kitang-kita sa presentations ninyo kung paano empowering yung concepts ng mapping at counter-mapping. May mga reflections kaya tayo kung paano posibleng nakakalimit yung concepts na ito. Paano kaya masasagot o mapaparinggan yung mga limitasyon na ito? That's the first question. The second one is, ano ba ang map sa wikang Pilipino? Not necessarily in the literal sense, pero baka may salita na nakukuha yung sense na gusto niyong or nating iparating sa paggamit ng counter mapping. So, question of language or concept or terms and limitations of counter mapping. Sige, we'll post those set of questions first and we can try to answer them, and then anyone wants to take a stab at these questions?
Subukan ko, Christian, I'll try, yung the one on disaster. Because mostly, syempre, yung mga communities are in marginalized lands as well, because these are disaster-prone areas. Counter mapping as an activity and as a process, we can work with local communities to at least, ensure that they have a voice in formulating local plans with respect to disaster risk reduction. So, for example, Philippine Geographical Society, who's also a partner of the network, they conduct participatory 3D modeling. So you have a 3D model of a particular place. And since this is geared towards broadening the understanding of the community and the scientific community as well, of the actual experiences of people on the ground, in the context of mapping urban communities that are prone to disaster, even in rural areas, where you have coastal areas prone to storm surge, ganyan. We can use counter mapping in the forms of more accessible maps for the local community, where they can put information there in their own initiative, not needing to wait for the LGU or for other institutions outside to input the information for them. They can readily update these kinds of 3D models, which they can make out of their own materials, cardboard, carton, but in practice for durability, we use rubber sheets. So these forms of mapping, when they are presented with satellite images, LiDAR images, people are knowledgeable of these contexts even if they are not presented with these aerial images. They do understand their vulnerability where they live, but there are reasons for not just evacuating the area when they're told to do so, or completely at least leaving the place, and not to come back there. These are safety issues also for the communities that are affected. And through counter mapping, we're hoping that in that process of coming up with solutions that would not disadvantage these communities, na hindi lang sila tatanggalin at kung saan ilalagay. If the LGU has this deep understanding of the history of the place, and why people in the first place would have to settle in these communities, it's really that question of how participatory the process is, and how open are the state actors in involving the local communities. So taking the counter mapping outside of that context, that's the mechanism that we would want, that everyone is getting their heads into the planning and really listening to the needs of the community. And with counter mapping, we're hoping to further, open up that process, not just involving the community, but also, being able to disseminate that story outside of the community, so that the community would have advocates coming from outside of the community to help them address potential issues of being displaced because of the narrative na that place is not safe. We have to ensure that that is being addressed. So we use counter mapping, but the will as well, no, to support these groups and see them through this contestations about space.
Thanks, Oni. Sira can try to answer Kenneth's first question regarding the limitations, constraints of counter mapping and mapping. So of course we kind of assume with the use of the term mapping, assume the importance of spatiality, that daily lives, livelihoods, power relations, and all these things play out in space. But of course we know that lives are more than spatial, and aspects of mapping or counter mapping can only do so much. So perhaps you recognize that the counter mapping has promise, but it's a kind of modest promise that it is not able to solve or address many of the issues that people face on the ground, and that it's part of kind of broader questions of power relations, knowledge production, struggle, resistance. So I think it's important to highlight that particular situatedness of counter mapping as an activity. And also, one other thing that I can think of would be how it's called counter mapping, but maps are kind of outputs that are often useful. But sometimes the tendency might be to focus on the output, the end product, which is the map. But on the arguments we are making is that counter mapping is a process, and it's a process that is more than just mapping. It's more than just maps. I mean, so that's also something that perhaps you could consider.
Christian.
Yes, Kenny, go ahead.
Dagdag lang din doon sa, thank you Kenneth for the question, na hindi lang maps yung ating output, at I think nabanggit mo rin yun kanina kay sa iyong presentation na may ilan tayong mga kasamahan din. Kung inyong maalala kay si Vanessa Banta, ginamit niya yung theater para mapahayag yung mga counter mapping na concept sa Sitio San Roque. Maaari ring ilan sa mga outputs din sa counter mapping sa New Clark City ay mga tula. At meron din tayong isang kasama na artist, si Anday Rit, na may iba't ibang forma din ng mga paintings para ipakita rin yung mga contestations, mga dispossession ng mga ideas with regards doon sa mga vulnerable at marginalized natin na community. Thank you.
Sir, may I?
Yes, Alvin, go ahead.
Yes, would just like to add something sa question ni Sir Max regarding disaster mapping. Currently, the government is doing vulnerability assessment. Kasi kung titingnan natin yung disaster at epekto nito, meron namang ginagawang vulnerability assessment mapping ang government para tingnan talaga kung ano yung mga geophysical attributes, no? Na para hindi parang haka-haka lang at anti-poor. Talagang tinitingnan, science-based ito. We call that vulnerability assessment mapping. So isang mapping technique din para makita natin yung masagot natin itong katanungan ni Sir Max na hindi siya against urban poor, but rather talagang science-based. No? So pwede naman ito to augment itong sa counter mapping na sinasabi. Pangalawa po, ako naman ay may katanungan, sir, if you don't mind. Number one, naiintindihan ko yung importance nitong counter mapping at maganda, kasi hindi lang naman po social yung nagbabangga ang puwersa, no, sa isang spatial area. Pwede naman ito perhaps in terms of biodiversity, no, ng mga invasive species, for example, versus natural, endemic species, ganyan. Pwede naman sa aspektong yon gamitin ang counter mapping. Ang gusto ko lang po sanang malaman kung ano po sa GIS, kasi parang related to GIS na itong ating pinag-uusapan, saan po tayo papasok doon? Are we going to use point data sources? Are we going to use vector or rather raster data? At kung meron po kayong example na ginamit yung GIS para makita natin kung paano i-manage through perhaps e-learning na mga techniques under GIS or geospatial na mga geostatistics rather na mga techniques na nakikita natin yung counter mapping po na ating sinasabi. Salamat po, sir.
Thank you, Alvin, especially for sharing the possibilities of highlighting the possibilities of using counter mapping, not only in kind of obviously social issues, but also in terms of how people also relate with the biophysical environment. I think that's also an important point. So regarding the question on data, Omi, you want to
Yes,
answer it?
yes. Thank you, Sir Alvin, sa iyong tanong. Maraming salamat din dun sa mga suggestions na nailahad mo kanina. I'm also a GIS specialist, working with both physical, geospatial, mga analysis, and there are several. We call it radical quantification in counter cartography, where you could make use of quantitative analysis that would include a vast array of geostatistical methods, looking at concentrations of patterns, clustering, for example, of poverty, all these things, no? In the particular example that was showed earlier on the New Clark City project, we made use of point data, plotting out yung mga communities through the help of satellite imagery, no, identifying the communities that are within or near the development of the extent, no, of the New Clark City, to be able to see where the settlements are with respect to the scope of the area and the plans na meron sila, because BCDA, for example, they have parang plano, no, land use plan for this, and through counter mapping, we were able, and through projecting that layer of information coming from the pamphlets, converting it into vector files, which we also converted into forms na mas friendly sa web, no, so that it can be viewed by a broader audience, but then also translated them into hard copy format of maps for the community to see. Ano ba yung plano ng BCDA doon sa aming komunidad, ano kaya yung mga posible nilang maging itayo ng mga structures dito, iba-ibang land uses. And so in that process, there's a learning for the community on their side na they became more aware of the general layout of the space that's being envisioned by the developers. And that was part, no, the use of satellite imagery, the use of, we also mapped yung mga houses using OSM, OpenStreetMap, open sources, no, so that the data can be available. We map to a larger public to counter yung sinasabi na idle land daw, walang nakatira, green fields lang naman yung lugar. Para ipakita na may mga tao doon, we actually draw yung locations or yung mga households, mga houses and structures, no, within the community. There are several works. I'm sure Christian can also refer you to references, pero locally perhaps I can refer you to the work of Professor Andre Ortega, where he used spatial analysis, statistical analysis, cluster analysis, to show kung what are the changes that happened in the Metro Manila region, what kinds of changes in terms of the population recently happened, no, in the last 10-20 years, I think, para ipakita kung ano yung development, ano yung nature ng development, o ano yung urbanization pagdating sa Metro Manila and how does it happen. Nasaan yung mga new clusters of settlements, may mga nagbago, may nag-change. So land cover change analysis. I mean, these things are the processes that we already are familiar with using GIS, remote sensing. But then I guess yung purpose kung bakit mo siya ginagawa would relate it to counter mapping as a process and as an activity, no? Para saan mo siya ginagawa, yung information that you're generating out of it, is it to support the rights of the marginalized and to help ensure na meron naman silang lugar sa pagpaplano ng kanilang area, no? Na meron din silang contribution sa biodiversity, no? Kung yun ang perspektibo na gustong palitawin sa pamamagitan ng paglalabas ng mga datos na ayon pa rin naman dun sa resulta ng scientific evaluation, no, and processes. So sa dulo, ang sagot dun ay kung para kanino natin siya binibigay yung datos, no, at kaninong realidad ang foreground natin para buuin yung storya ng komunidad. Kasama na yung physical environment, social, and all other aspects. So thank you so much also sa suggestion.
Yes, ma'am. Maganda po yung sinabi niyo actually, pero it will, on my part, parang it would become a great challenge really, para ipalabas kung ano talaga yung mga real scenarios, current realities on the ground. Kasi sometimes it's a bit of a challenge really, we can start with community mapping, for instance. And from community mapping, we can, elevate that into GIS-based mapping and modeling. Pero yun nga it is very, gusto ko lang i-highlight, it's very critical really, yung pagpalabas ng information. Kasi we might have all the tools, we might have all the means how to do this and that, but yung information itself, paano ba na hindi biased, number one. Pangalawa, yung reluctance nung nagbibigay ng information. Kasi otherwise, ultimately, if we're going to do counter mapping, napakalaking bagay kasi nun yung degree ng information na binibigay. Kaya ako po natanong kanina, patungkol sa point data source, na-mention nyo na rin, kasi critical yung information na ilalagay natin sa point data at kailangan ito'y validated kasi it could be na, di ba alam niyo yung pag nasa community, minsan ayaw magsalita or kung magsasalita man, pilit o ganito lang gustong ilabas. So paano natin mabibridge yung gap na yon at mailagay, matranslate sa point data para ma-process natin using the tools ng GIS. So parang yun ang doon ako na nahihirapan, ma'am, kung paano mabibridge yon. Kasi kung minsan yung information na ibibigay is different I'm speaking nasa government po kasi ako. So although nasa research sa government, medyo may reluctance ang tao, for example, na mag-lay down ng kanyang cards kasi nasa government ka. Ngayon, pagkukuha naman ako ng secondary data coming from another source, syempre magdadalawang isip din ako kung paano kinandak yung pag-gather ng data. So yung gray areas na yon, I believe kailangan muna nating i-address yon prior to any counter mapping that should be done through GIS. Kasi yung kumbaga ang quality ng counter map mo magde-depend doon, di po ba? So anyways, salamat po sa mga na-share nyo. At least parang yung takbo ng isip, ganito pala gagawin, nakuha ko na. Thank you very much, ma'am. Ma'am Sim, thank you po.
Salamat din, sir. Thank you po so much.
Thank you. So we have a couple more questions. So one question is, what happens after counter mapping where institutions or persons responsible for marginalization or oppression called out? That's also an important point to consider. And the other one is from Irvik Kang. Thank you to all the speakers for a very provocative discussion. My question is, how can we encourage younger generation to engage in counter mapping?
Sir, pwede po siguro akong sumagot dito.
Okay, CBM.
Ayun. Ayun, thank you, Irvik. Ayun. Siyempre yung counter mapping, higit sa mga methodologies na involved dun sa movement na ito or dun sa approach na ito sa espasyo. Ito ay militant and radical na approach para dun sa mga communities natin na nasa ilalim ng marginalization, displacement, at iba pang dominant structures sa lipunan. So, yung pag-i-introduce nito sa mas nakababatang generation, kagaya ng pagtuturo ninyo ng mga nauna sa amin na mga counter mappers. Siyempre, palalalimin mo muna yung kaunawaan niya sa komunidad, sa social realities, at kung sino-sino ba talaga yung may hawak ng espasyo natin. Kapag naintindihan niya yon, sa pamamagitan ng paglubog dun sa mga komunidad, pakikipag-usap sa mga tao, hindi lang para kuhanan sila ng impormasyon o gumawa ng output para sa kanila, kundi para tulungan talaga sila na ma-erase yung kanilang campaigns. Kapag nababad siya sa ganitong mga activities, makikita niya na yung counter mapping ay hindi lang pala isang pag-aaral, kundi paglaban kasama yung komunidad. Ayun, so sa pagtuturo ng iba't ibang methodologies, ma-encounter niya yan along the way at mismong komunidad pa yung magtuturo sa kanya ng mga paraan kung paano nila gustong lumaban, mga paraan na kaya nilang gawin, mga paraan na sa tingin nila effective para dun sa pag-raise ng kanilang mga boses. At hindi yun ini-impose sa kanila. So yung pagtuturo na maging counter mapper ay hindi para lang dito sa mga akademya, kundi komunidad mismo yung magtuturo sa kanila noon. At syempre, kung paano tinuruan sila ng komunidad, magiging dialectical naman yung proseso. Hindi pwedeng iiwan na lagi, kagaya po nung isa pang tanong, in relation, ay hindi lang basta ito pag-iwan doon sa komunidad after nung outputs, after nung research. Ito po ay matagal na commitment at kumbaga, relasyon na ito sa komunidad na pinaglilingkuran ng counter mapping. So, ayun po. In short, in summary po, yung pagtuturo sa mga younger generations ng counter mapping ay hindi lang mula sa atin, mula sa nasa Zoom participants na ito, kundi lalo na doon sa mga bahagi ng lipunan na hindi na merong pinaglalaban sa kanilang mga espasyo at gustong i-counter yung kanilang mga espasyo. Ayun po.
Thank you, Miguel, for highlighting the importance of counter mapping for the younger generation. Does anyone want to answer the question regarding what happens after? Siguro ano yung sa mga particular examples natin, ano yung saan siya nagamit or how was it successful or not successful in those particular campaigns?
Christian?
Yeah, go ahead, Danny.
So siguro doon sa New Clark City, so ang nangyari doon ay may mga outputs na na-generate, iniwan yun sa community at nagamit yun for their planning at nagamit din ito para mag-open up ng dialogue sa LGU at pati sa BCDA. In fact, ay sa tulong ng community organizer doon, nagsiset up or parang nagsiset ng appointment sa BCDA para magkaroon ng engagement, para magkaroon ng usapan. Pero yun nga, parating hindi natutuloy at hindi nagsasucceed yung mga conversations na yun. So sana yun din yung isa sa mga maaari ring gawin na pakipag-usap sa community at meron namang mga community organizers na pwede ring makipag-engage. At very open din actually yung community organizers para mag-reach out din sa mga kinaukulan. Yun naman din ang isa sa mga aim or goal natin dito sa pag-produce ng mga outputs such as maps para magamit yon as point of conversation ng iba't ibang mga stakeholders sa community. So hindi lang local communities, kundi paano rin ito, paano mag-uusap yung mga nasa LGU, yung mga, iba't ibang mga stakeholders doon sa mga projects na nabanggit kanina, yung na-share ng ating mga panelists. So yun, maraming salamat.
Okay, thank you, Yanni. Perhaps if there are no more questions, so we can conclude our open forum. So thank you for the questions. They were helpful in kind of moving forward the discussion regarding various issues in the principle and the conduct of counter mapping activities. So we're looking forward to hearing more from you in the coming events and seeing you in the next events. Let me just tell you a bit about the feedback form. So if you would like to receive a certificate of attendance, if it's needed for you, or if you just would like to give us feedback, you may please fill out this particular form, feedback form shown here in the link. You might take note of that particular link so that will automatically generate certificate of attendance if you would be needing it. Okay. Okay, so thank you very much for joining. I think we have